When rancher Clay Hartman rode to Miles City Station expecting a quiet, practical bride, he found Mara Winslow gripping the hands of 5-year-old twins instead. This wasn't what he'd paid for. This wasn't even close. She said she'd sent a letter about the children, a letter that never arrived. On that dusty platform in Montana Territory, June 1883, Clay faced a choice that would reshape his solitary life forever. Send her back east, or marry a stranger with 2 frightened children before sundown. If you're ready to hear how a man built for loneliness learned to build a family instead, stay with me to the end. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel. The June sun hammered down on Miles City like a blacksmith's anvil, turning the dirt roads into dust and the waiting into something Clay Hartman could feel in his back teeth. He stood on the station platform with his hat pulled low, watching the eastern horizon where the rail line cut through the prairie grass like a scar. The train was late. 15 minutes, then 20. Long enough for doubt to creep in, though Clay had never been a man who entertained doubt for very long. He'd paid good money for this arrangement. $50 to the matrimonial agency in Chicago, plus another $20 for the train fare. The letter had been clear. A woman of practical disposition, accustomed to hard work, seeking a quiet life far from city concerns. No mention of beauty or charm or any of the soft things men fool themselves into wanting. Clay had specified exactly what he needed. Someone who understood that the Tongue River country didn't offer ease, didn't promise comfort, and sure as hell didn't reward weakness. The ranch sat 12 miles north of town, carved out of land that had belonged to the Cheyenne until treaties and broken promises pushed them onto reservations. Clay had built the cabin himself, cutting timber from the hills and hauling stones from the creek bed. 3 rooms, a good well, fences that held most of the time. It was enough for one man and the livestock he ran, 30 head of cattle, a few horses, chickens that laid when they felt like it. He thought it might be enough for 2. He'd been wrong before. The train whistle cut through his thoughts, sharp and distant. Clay straightened, brushing dust from his vest, though it wouldn't make much difference. His hands were calloused, stained with work that never fully washed away. His boots were good, but worn. He was 34 years old and looked older, the kind of weathering that came from sleeping light and rising before dawn every day for a decade. The locomotive appeared first, black smoke against blue sky, then the cars behind it, rattling and groaning as they slowed. Clay moved to the edge of the platform, scanning the windows for a woman traveling alone. The agency had sent a photograph, small, grainy, showing a plain-faced woman with dark hair pulled back severe. He'd barely looked at it. Faces didn't matter much when you were sharing silence across a dinner table and rising in the dark to feed stock. The train lurched to a stop with a shriek of brakes and a hiss of steam. Doors opened. A handful of passengers stepped down. 2 men in business suits, an elderly couple, a family with luggage stacked high. Clay waited, his jaw set, watching each face that appeared in the doorway. Then he saw her. She stood in the train car's opening, hesitating at the top of the steps, and nothing about her matched the photograph or the promise or the careful arrangement he'd made. She was younger than he'd expected, early 20s maybe, with auburn hair escaping from pins that had given up the fight hours ago. Her dress was gray wool, decent but worn thin at the cuffs and collar. Dust streaked one shoulder. Her face carried the kind of exhaustion that sleep wouldn't fix. But that wasn't what stopped Clay's breath in his chest. It was the children. 2 of them, small and pale, clinging to her hands like she was the only solid thing in a tilting world. Twins, by the look of them, a girl with braids coming loose, and a boy whose shirt was buttoned wrong. 5 years old, maybe 6. Their eyes were too wide, too careful, the eyes of children who'd learned early that the world didn't always mean well. The woman, Mara, the agency had called her Mara Winslow, met Clay's stare across the platform. She didn't smile, didn't look away either, just stood there at the top of those steps with a child on each side and a worn canvas bag at her feet, waiting for him to make the first move. Clay felt the heat come up from his collar, felt his hands curl into fists at his sides. This wasn't the arrangement. This wasn't even close. He'd been clear in his letters. No complications, no entanglements. A woman alone, willing to work, willing to accept the isolation of the Tongue River Ranch without complaint or expectation of things he couldn't provide. The agency had confirmed it in writing. Mara Winslow, 22 years old, no living family, seeking a fresh start in the territories. Not a damn word about children. The conductor appeared behind her, impatient, and Mara descended the steps carefully, one hand gripping the rail while the twins pressed close to her skirts. When her feet touched the platform, she stood perfectly still for a moment, looking at Clay like she was measuring him against some internal standard he'd already failed. Then she walked toward him. Not fast, not slow, just steady, the way a person moves when they've already accepted the likelihood of disaster and decided to meet it head-on anyway. The twins stayed glued to her sides, their small faces tilted up at Clay with an expression he recognized from colts that had been broke too hard, ready to bolt but too tired to run. Mr. Hartman, her voice was low, rougher than he'd expected. Eastern accent still there but worn down at the edges, the way a stone gets smooth in a river. I'm Mara Winslow. Clay didn't move, didn't offer his hand, just looked at her, then at the children, then back at her again. You're not what I ordered, he said. The words came out flat, matter of fact. The way he'd tell a merchant the flour he'd bought was full of weevils. Something flickered across Mara's face. Not surprise, not hurt. More like confirmation of something she'd already known. She didn't step back, didn't drop her gaze. I sent a letter, she said, 3 weeks ago, explaining about Lila and Luke. I never got it. I know that now. The station master was watching from the ticket window, not even pretending not to listen. A farm wagon rolled past on the street behind them, wheels creaking in the ruts. Somewhere a dog barked, high and anxious. Clay felt the weight of the moment settling on his shoulders like a yoke he hadn't agreed to carry. He'd come to town expecting one thing, a simple transaction, a practical solution to the problem of loneliness and long winters. Instead, he'd found a woman with children, complications written all over her like a brand. Who are they? He asked, nodding at the twins. Mara's expression didn't change, but her hands tightened slightly on the children's shoulders. Mine. My sister's children, now mine. She died last winter. Influenza. Their father went 2 years before that. I'm all they have. The agency didn't ask if I had dependents. They asked if I was unattached. I am. These children aren't attachments. They're my responsibility. Clay felt his back teeth clench. He'd come prepared for a lot of things. Awkwardness, sure. Stiff conversation over a long ride back to the ranch. The strange intimacy of sharing space with someone whose habits he didn't know. But this, standing on a platform arguing with a woman he'd paid to marry, while 2 silent children watched him like he was a wolf circling their camp, this he hadn't prepared for. You should have been straight about it, he said. I tried to be. Trying doesn't count for much when a man makes arrangements based on what he's told. No, Mara agreed quietly. I don't suppose it does. The train whistle blew again, sharp and impatient. The conductor called for final boarding. Around them, the platform was emptying, passengers claimed, luggage loaded, people moving toward whatever futures they'd planned or stumbled into. Clay looked at the children again. The girl, Lila, had dark eyes and a set to her jaw that reminded him uncomfortably of Mara. The boy, Luke, was thinner, paler, one hand twisted in his sister's dress. Neither of them had said a word. They just stood there, waiting for the adults to decide their fate, like they'd stood waiting before and knew how this usually ended. Something in Clay's chest twisted, sharp and unwelcome. There's an eastbound train day after tomorrow, he said. I can put you up at the boarding house until then. Pay your fare back to Chicago. Mara nodded slowly, like she'd expected nothing else. That's fair. She didn't argue, didn't plead, just accepted it the way she seemed to accept everything, with a straight spine and level eyes and the kind of quiet dignity that made Clay feel smaller than he wanted to. All right then, he said. But he didn't move, didn't turn toward the street where his wagon waited, just stood there looking at this woman who'd come 1,000 miles carrying more weight than he'd ever agreed to share, and tried to make himself walk away. Mr. Hartman, Mara's voice was soft now, careful. May I ask you something? He nodded, wary. When you sent your letters to the agency, when you described what you wanted, did you ask for someone who'd never known hardship? Someone who'd never had to choose between bad options and worse ones? Someone who'd never learned to carry more than seemed possible? Clay frowned. I asked for someone practical. Then I'm what showed up. The words hung between them, simple and impossible to refute. She wasn't arguing her case, wasn't making promises about how easy she'd make things or how little trouble the children would be. She was just standing there, stating a fact, and waiting for him to decide if facts mattered. Clay looked past her at the emptying train, the conductor stepping back aboard, the door closing with a metallic clang. He thought about the ranch, the silence that filled it, the way even good days felt like treading water, the long winters when the only voice he heard was his own. He thought about the cabin he'd built, 3 rooms that had always seemed too big and too small at the same time. He thought about his own childhood, though he tried not to. The farm outside Pittsburgh where he'd grown up, working land that belonged to someone else. His father, breaking horses and breaking himself in the process. His mother, quiet and worn. The siblings he'd lost to scarlet fever and accident, and the grinding poverty that killed just as sure as sickness. The way he'd left at 17 with nothing but stubbornness and a promise to himself that he'd build something that was his, something that couldn't be taken away. He'd kept that promise, built the ranch, proved up his claim, made something solid out of Montana dirt and his own refusal to quit. But he'd built it alone, and somewhere in the building he'd forgotten how to imagine it any other way. Until now. The boarding house is full, he heard himself say. The lie came easy, automatic. Mrs. Patterson mentioned it yesterday. Territorial legislatures meeting in town this week. Mara's expression didn't change, but something shifted in her eyes, a quick calculation, a reassessment. I see. Ranch is 12 miles north, 3-room cabin, stock to tend, garden that needs work. Winter comes early up on the Tongue River, stays late. He was talking too much, listing facts like he was describing the property to a potential buyer. It's not easy country, not gentle. I didn't come looking for gentle. The children can work. Not like adults, but they can help. They're quick learners, quiet. They won't be trouble. Clay almost laughed at that. Children were trouble by definition, noise and needs and complications that multiplied faster than cattle. But looking at these two, at their careful stillness and the way they stood so close to Mara they might as well be attached, he wondered if maybe they'd already learned not to be. There's a church in town, he said. Pastor Whitmore. We could be married before sundown if you're willing. He watched the words land, watched Mara process them. Her face went very still, her hands tightening again on the children's shoulders. For a long moment she didn't speak, and Clay prepared himself for refusal, for the sensible rejection this whole situation deserved. Then Mara nodded, just once, quick and definite. I'm willing. No joy in it, no relief even, just acceptance of the next hard choice in what had probably been a long line of them. All right then. Clay picked up her canvas bag, lighter than it should be, containing less than a woman ought to own, and turned toward the street. Wagons this way. They followed him in silence. Mara and the twins, across the platform and down the steps to where his wagon waited in the shade of the feed store. It was a working rig, practical and worn, the bed carrying fence posts and a crate of supplies he'd picked up earlier. Clay set the bag among the posts and held out his hand to help Mara up. She hesitated, then took it. Her palm was rough, calloused from work he could only guess at. She climbed into the seat without grace, but without difficulty either, then reached down for the children. Luke scrambled up first, small and quick. Lila followed, slower, more cautious, her eyes on Clay the whole time. When they were settled, Mara in the middle, children pressed tight on either side, Clay took his place at the reins. The horses, a matched pair of bays he'd raised from colts, stamped and shifted, ready to be moving. First time in Montana? He asked as he turned the wagon toward Main Street. First time west of Illinois. Long way from home. I don't have a home. Mara said it simply, without self-pity. Haven't for a while now. Clay didn't ask more. They rode through town in silence, broken only by the wagon's creaking and the horses' hooves on packed dirt. Miles City wasn't much. 24 buildings clustered around the station, a few more scattered along the river where the army fort had been before they'd moved it east. Storefronts with painted signs, a bank, a saloon that wouldn't be busy for another few hours, the boarding house where Clay had lied about there being no room. People watched them pass. Mrs. Patterson on the boarding house steps, the blacksmith pausing his hammer, old Samuel Reeves sitting outside the general store, whittling. They'd all heard about Clay's mail-order bride, about the stranger coming in on today's train. Small towns didn't keep secrets well. Tomorrow they'd all know about the children, too. The church sat at the far end of town, white-clapboard with a bell tower that leaned slightly east. Clay pulled the wagon up beside it and set the brake. Pastor Whitmore emerged before they'd even climbed down, wiping his hands on a cloth, his weathered face curious. "Clay." He nodded, then looked at Mara. "This must be your intended." "Mara Winslow," Clay said. "We'd like to marry. Today, if you're able." The pastor's gaze dropped to the children, lingered, then returned to Clay's face. Whatever question formed there, he had the grace not to ask it aloud. "I'm able. Come inside." The church was dim and cool after the heat of the afternoon, smelling of old wood and candle wax. Clay took off his hat. Mara smoothed her hair with one hand, a futile gesture that didn't accomplish much. The twins stayed close, their small faces tilted up at the vaulted ceiling like they were trying to decide if this place was safe. "Do you have witnesses?" Pastor Whitmore asked. "No. I'll fetch my wife then. Won't be but a minute." He disappeared through a side door, leaving them standing in the aisle between rough-hewn pews. Clay became suddenly, acutely aware of Mara beside him, the rise and fall of her breathing, the dust on her dress, the way she held herself like a woman braced for impact. "You can still change your mind," he said quietly. "I meant what I offered. Boarding house. Train fare." Mara turned to look at him, her expression unreadable in the church's dim light. "Can you?" "What?" "Change your mind once we do this." Clay thought about it, the promises he'd make in a few minutes, the vows that would bind him to this stranger and her ready-made family, the way his life would shift, the silence of his cabin filling with voices he didn't know yet, the risk of it, the sheer foolishness of marrying a woman he'd met less than an hour ago just because she'd shown up carrying more than he'd bargained for. "No," he said, "I don't go back on my word. Neither do I." The pastor returned with his wife, a small woman with kind eyes who took one look at the twins and produced peppermint sticks from her apron pocket. Luke took his hesitantly. Lila refused until Mara nodded permission, then accepted it with a whispered thank you that was the first sound Clay had heard from either child. "Shall we begin?" Pastor Whitmore opened his Bible, the pages worn soft from use. They stood before him, Clay and Mara, while the twins sat in the front pew under Mrs. Whitmore's gentle supervision. The ceremony was brief. No music, no flowers, no gathering of family and friends, just words, old and formal, that somehow carried weight despite their simplicity. Clay spoke his vows in a voice that didn't waver. Mara spoke hers the same way. They had no rings, so they simply joined hands when instructed, rough palm to rough palm, two people agreeing to share a burden neither had chosen, but both had accepted. "I pronounce you man and wife." The pastor closed his Bible. "What the Lord has joined together, let no man put asunder." It was done. Just like that. Less than 2 hours after stepping off the train, Mara Winslow had become Mara Hartman, and Clay had acquired not just a wife, but a family he'd never planned for. He should have felt trapped, should have felt the weight of mistakes settling over him. Instead, he just felt tired and strangely calm, like he'd made a choice he'd been avoiding for years and could finally stop running from it. They signed the register in the pastor's office. Mara's handwriting small and careful, Clay's a rough scrawl that had never improved despite his mother's best efforts. The pastor's wife provided coffee and bread, which the twins ate quickly, like they'd learned not to assume there'd be more. Mara barely touched hers. "Where will you be living, Mrs.?" Whitmore asked, making conversation that was probably meant to ease the strangeness of the situation. "My ranch," Clay said, "up on the Tongue River." "Oh, that's lovely country. Isolated, though. You'll be 12 miles from town." 14 from the nearest neighbor, Clay added. He looked at Mara. "That going to be a problem?" "No." She met his eyes steadily. "I'm not afraid of isolation." "What about the children? They'll need schooling eventually." "I can teach them to read and cipher. That'll do for now. Mrs. Whitmore looked like she wanted to say more, but her husband placed a gentle hand on her arm. They'd done what was needed. The rest was between Clay and the stranger he'd just married. Outside, the afternoon was stretching toward evening, the sun hanging lower but still bright enough to make Clay squint. He helped Mara and the twins into the wagon again, conscious now of how permanent this arrangement had become. No going back. No changing course. The ride out of town was quiet. They passed the last buildings, then the fort ruins, then nothing but grassland rolling toward distant hills. The road was decent at first, worn by freight wagons hauling supplies to the mining camps farther north. After 5 miles, it deteriorated to little more than ruts, and Clay had to slow the horses to keep from jarring loose every bolt in the wagon bed. Lila fell asleep against Mara's side, her small head drooping. Luke stayed awake, watching the landscape pass with wide eyes, taking in the vastness of it, the space that went on forever in every direction, the sky so big it seemed to curve overhead, the silence broken only by birdsong and the wagon's creak and the constant whisper of wind through grass. "It's different here," he said suddenly. His voice was thin, high, uncertain. "Different how?" Clay asked. The boy thought about it. Empty. Not empty, just spread out. Animals everywhere if you know how to look. Deer in the coulees, antelope on the flats, hawks hunting, even bears up in the breaks. Luke's eyes went wide. Bears? Sometimes. They mostly keep to themselves. Mostly? Mara's voice carried a note of dry humor. Nothing's guaranteed in this country, Mrs. Hartman, but the bears aren't usually the worst problem. What is? Clay considered the question, the 100 different ways the Tongue River country could kill a person who wasn't careful or prepared or just plain lucky. Weather, isolation, injury far from help, the kind of loneliness that ate at a person from the inside until they did something desperate or foolish. Winter, he said finally. Winter's the hardest part. They rode on as the sun dropped lower, painting the grass gold and the hills purple. Clay pointed out landmarks, the creek that marked the boundary of his claimed land, the ridge where he'd built a shelter for cattle when storms came through, the stand of cottonwoods that meant water and shade. Finally, as the sun touched the western horizon, the ranch came into view. It wasn't much. Clay knew that. 3-room cabin built from logs he'd cut and hauled himself, chinked with mud that needed replacing every few years. A barn that leaned slightly south but held together. Corrals made from lodgepole pine, a chicken coop, a root cellar dug into the hillside. 30 head of cattle scattered across the pasture, a few horses in the near corral. Honest work. Hard one. His. Mara didn't say anything, just looked at it all, measuring and assessing, while the twins pressed close to her sides. Clay pulled the wagon up beside the cabin and set the brake. "Well," he said, "this is it." Mara climbed down before he could offer help, then lifted the twins down one at a time. She stood looking at the cabin, at the mountains rising dark behind it, at the creek running silver in the last light. "It's good land," she said finally. "It'll do." Better than I expected. Clay couldn't quite tell if that was a compliment or just honesty. He grabbed her bag from the wagon bed and led them to the cabin door. It stuck, always had, the frame settling unevenly, and he had to put his shoulder into it before it swung open. Inside was dim and cool, smelling of smoke and leather and the faint mustiness of a place that had held only one person for too long. Clay lit a lamp and warm light spread across the main room, a table he'd built from cottonwood, 4 chairs that didn't quite match, a stove that radiated residual heat, shelves holding supplies, and a few books. "2 bedrooms, he said, pointing. "That one's mine. You and the children can take the other. There's a loft above, but it's not finished." Mara set the twins down and moved to the bedroom door, pushing it open. Clay followed, watching her take in the simple space, a bed frame he'd made, a straw tick mattress, a trunk at the foot, one window facing east. "This is your room," she said. She did. "I'll move my things to the loft." "You don't have to." "I do." Clay kept his voice level, matter of fact. "I'm not expecting. We just met. You need privacy. Time." Mara turned to look at him, and something in her expression shifted. Surprise, maybe, or relief? Or both. Thank you. He nodded, suddenly uncomfortable with her gratitude. I'll bring in water. You can get settled. Outside, the last light was fading fast. Clay hauled buckets from the well, pumping hard, feeling the familiar burn in his shoulders. When he carried them inside, Mara was already moving through the cabin with the efficiency of someone who'd learned to make do in unfamiliar spaces. She'd found the wash basin, located the pantry, and was studying the stove like she was memorizing its quirks. The twins sat at the table, still silent, still watchful. Clay set the water buckets down. There's beans and bacon, cornbread from yesterday. Not fancy, but it'll fill you. I can cook, Mara said. I know, but not tonight. Tonight you just need to rest. He prepared the simple meal while Mara washed the children's hands and faces, her movements gentle but practiced. They ate together at the table, the silence between them settling into something almost companionable. The twins ate slowly, carefully, like they were still waiting for the other shoe to drop. When the meal was finished, Mara stood. I'll clean up. Leave it. Morning's soon enough. She looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. Luke, Lila, come on. Time for bed. They followed her to the bedroom like small shadows. Clay heard the creak of the bed frame, the soft murmur of Mara's voice reading them something. A story, maybe, or just quiet words to settle them. He sat at the table in the lamplight, listening to the sounds of this new, strange family arranging themselves in his home, and wondered what the hell he'd done. But when Mara emerged 20 minutes later, pulling the bedroom door mostly closed behind her, he found he didn't regret it. They're exhausted, she said quietly. It's been a long few weeks. For you too. For all of us. She sat down across from him, folding her hands on the table. Mr. Hartman. Clay. Clay. She tried the name out, cautious. I need you to understand something. I'm grateful for what you did today, taking us in when you had every right not to, but I won't be a burden. The children and I will work. We'll earn our keep. I'm not asking for charity. I didn't think you were. And I won't. She paused, choosing words carefully. I won't expect things that weren't part of the original arrangement. I know what you asked for, and I know I'm not it. So whatever this is, this marriage, it can be whatever we make it, nothing more. Clay studied her in the lamplight. This woman who'd traveled 1,000 miles carrying children that weren't hers, who'd stood on a platform and stated facts instead of begging, who'd married a stranger because it was the best bad option available. Fair enough, he said. But you should know something too. I don't go back on my word. You're my wife now, legal and proper. That means you're under my protection, you and the children both. Anyone tries to say different, they'll answer to me. Something flickered across Mara's face, an emotion too quick to name. Thank you. They sat in silence for another minute, the lamp burning low, the night pressing close around the cabin. Finally, Clay stood. I'll bed down in the loft. There's blankets in the trunk if you need extra. We'll be fine. Morning comes early, 4:30, usually. I'll try to be quiet. You won't wake us. Mara rose, moving toward the bedroom door. She paused with her hand on the frame. Clay, what you did today, taking us in, marrying me anyway, that was decent. More than decent. I won't forget it. Then she was gone, closing the door softly behind her, leaving Clay alone in the main room with the dying lamp and the enormous reality of what he'd committed himself to. He climbed to the loft, spread his bedroll on the rough boards, and lay staring at the ceiling while night sounds filtered through the walls, owls hunting, cattle shifting in the pasture, the eternal wind. Below him, in the bedroom that had been his until tonight, 3 people were sleeping. A woman he'd known for hours. Children who weren't his blood. His family now. For better or worse. Clay closed his eyes and tried not to think about all the ways this could go wrong. But sleep was a long time coming, and when it finally arrived, it was thin and restless, full of dreams he couldn't quite remember come morning. Dawn broke cold and gray, the kind of Montana morning that promised nothing but hard work ahead. Clay woke in the loft to the sound of his own breathing and the creak of floorboards below. Someone was already moving, light footsteps, careful and quiet, the scrape of the stove door opening. He dressed quickly in the dim light, pulling on yesterday's shirt and the canvas pants that smelled of horse and dirt. When he descended the ladder, he found Mara at the stove, coaxing last night's coals back to life. She'd changed into a different dress, still gray, still worn, but cleaner. Her hair was pinned back tight, already escaping in wisps around her face. She looked up when his boots hit the floor but didn't startle. "Coffee's almost ready." "You didn't have to." "I know." She fed another stick of wood into the firebox, adjusting the damper with practiced ease. "But I'm awake, and idle hands don't suit me much." Clay moved to the window, looking out at the pasture where his cattle were dark shapes against the pale grass. The chickens would need feeding soon. Fence line on the north pasture needed walking. He'd spotted a weak post 2 days ago that probably wouldn't hold through the next hard wind. "What time do the children usually wake?" he asked. "Depends. Sometimes early, sometimes not. They've learned to be quiet either way." There was something in the way she said it, matter of fact but carrying weight, that made Clay wonder what kind of life those twins had lived before Mara took them in. He didn't ask. A man learned early in this country that some stories came out when they were ready, and pushing only drove people deeper into silence. Mara poured coffee into 2 tin cups, handed him one. The brew was strong, bitter, exactly how he made it. She'd found the grounds in the pantry, figured out his measure without being told. "Thank you." She nodded, wrapping both hands around her own cup like she was trying to pull warmth from it. They stood in the quiet kitchen while light slowly filled the windows. 2 strangers who'd promised their lives to each other less than 12 hours ago, learning the shape of shared silence. "I need to walk the fence line this morning," Clay said. "North pasture. After that, there's a calf I've been watching. First-time mother, having trouble nursing. Wood needs splitting for winter stock. Chicken coop doors hanging crooked." Mara listened without interrupting, her eyes on her coffee. "I'm not listing it to complain," he added. "Just so you know what the days look like here. There's always more work than daylight." "I understand work." She looked up at him then, her gaze direct. "What do you need from me today?" Clay hadn't expected the question, the simple offer of help without negotiation or caveat. He thought about the garden plot behind the cabin, overgrown, half-wild, producing less each year because he couldn't spare the time to tend it properly. The mending that had been piling up for months. The cabin itself, which had the functionality of a working space but none of the comfort of a home. "Garden needs attention," he said, "if you're willing. And there's a root cellar that could use organizing before we start putting up preserves for winter, but nothing that can't wait if you and the children need time to settle." "We'll settle while we work." Mara set down her cup. "That's how we've always done it." Before Clay could respond, a small sound came from the bedroom. A child's voice, thin and uncertain, calling for Mara. She moved immediately, setting down her cup and disappearing through the door. Clay heard her murmuring, soothing, then the quiet shuffle of small feet on floorboards. The twins emerged clinging to Mara's skirts, their faces creased from sleep, and still carrying that watchful wariness. Luke's eyes found Clay immediately, tracking him like a threat that needed monitoring. Lila pressed closer to Mara, one hand twisted in the fabric of her aunt's dress. "Morning," Clay said, keeping his voice level and quiet. Neither child responded. Mara's hand settled on Luke's shoulder, gentle but firm. "Say good morning to Mr. Hartman." "Good morning," they whispered in unison, the words automatic and empty. "Clay's fine," he said. "Mr. Hartman sounds like someone important." Mara's mouth twitched. Not quite a smile, but close. She guided the children to the table, settled them in chairs, then moved to the pantry. "Is there meal for porridge?" "Second shelf. Molasses too, if they'll eat it." She prepared breakfast while Clay pulled on his boots and coat, watching from the corner of his eye as she navigated his kitchen with increasing confidence. The twins sat perfectly still at the table, hands folded, waiting. They didn't squirm or complain or ask questions the way children usually did. They just waited, like waiting was something they'd learned to do well. Mara served the porridge in clay bowls, drizzled molasses over the top, set the portions in front of the children. "Not too fast," she said quietly. "You'll get sick." They ate slowly, carefully, their spoons scraping the bowls clean. When they finished, they sat with empty bowls in front of them, still waiting for permission to move. "You can get down," Mara said. "Stay inside, stay together. Don't touch anything without asking first." They slipped from their chairs and retreated to a corner of the main room, sitting on the floor with their backs against the wall, watching everything and saying nothing. Clay pulled on his hat. I'll be back by noon to check that calf. If you need anything before then, we'll manage. He nodded and stepped outside into the cold morning. The air smelled of sage and coming rain, the sky heavy with clouds rolling in from the west. Weather was changing. They'd have precipitation before nightfall, and this late in June it would be cold rain, the kind that soaked through clothes and made every task twice as miserable. He'd need to move faster than planned. The fence line took 2 hours to walk, and Clay found 3 posts that needed replacing, not just one. The wood had rotted at the base where moisture collected, weakening the whole structure. He marked them with strips of cloth torn from an old shirt, making mental notes of what he'd need from town: new posts, wire, staples. Money he'd have to find somewhere, because the $50 he'd sent to Chicago had been most of his ready cash. When he returned to the cabin, he found it transformed. Not dramatically, nothing about the structure had changed, but in the small ways that marked the difference between a place where a man lived and a place where people made a home. The breakfast dishes were washed and stacked. The floor had been swept. The windows, which Clay hadn't cleaned properly in months, now let in clear light that showed just how much dust he'd been living with. Mara was outside, kneeling in the garden plot with her sleeves rolled up and dirt under her fingernails. The twins worked beside her, Luke pulling weeds with fierce concentration, Lila gathering them into a pile. None of them spoke, but they moved together with the coordination of people who'd worked side by side before. Clay approached slowly, not wanting to startle them. Mara glanced up, pushing hair from her face with the back of one hand. "Fence?" she asked. "Needs work. 3 posts rotted through. Can it wait?" "Has to. Town's a day's ride, and I can't spare 2 days right now." Mara nodded and returned her attention to the tangle of weeds choking what had once been neat rows. "This garden could feed more than just you if it was tended proper." "I know." "When's the last time you put anything up for winter? Preserves, pickles, anything?" Clay had to think about it. 2 years, maybe 3. Store-bought's easier. Store-bought's expensive. Mara sat back on her heels, surveying the plot with a critical eye. "And it won't last if you can't get to town. You have mason jars?" "Some, in the root cellar. I'll need more. And lids. Seeds, too, though it's late in the season for starting much." She was already planning, her mind moving ahead to problems Clay hadn't considered. "What about hunting? Do you take deer?" "When I can. Got 2 last fall." "That'll need smoking. You have a smokehouse?" "No. We'll need to build one before the weather turns." She pulled another weed, added it to the pile. "Chickens laying steady?" "Most days." "How many birds?" "Dozen, give or take." "Should be more. And you'll want to put some back for winter, canned or preserved in lard." She looked up at him again, her expression serious. "Clay, I don't mean to overstep. This is your ranch, your decisions. But if you want us to survive winter without burning through your cash reserves, there's work that needs doing now, while the weather holds." Clay studied her. This woman who'd been on his land less than a day and was already seeing gaps he'd stopped noticing because filling them alone had seemed impossible. She wasn't wrong. He'd been living season to season, doing enough to get by but never enough to get ahead. One hard winter, one bad illness, one stroke of serious bad luck, and the whole operation would collapse. "Tell me what you need," he said. Mara blinked, surprise flickering across her face like she'd expected argument instead of agreement. "Time, mostly, and supplies I can work with. The rest I can figure out. Make a list. I'll see what I can spare from the account in town." "Clay, you're right about winter, and about needing to preserve what we can. If you know how to do it, I'm not fool enough to argue." He glanced at the twins, still working steadily through the weeds. "Can they help? Or are they too young?" "They can help. They're stronger than they look." Luke chose that moment to stand up, dragging a root system that seemed half his size. He stumbled, caught himself, kept pulling until the whole tangled mass came free from the earth. His thin face was set with determination, jaw clenched tight. "I see that," Clay said quietly. He left them to their work and went to check the calf. The first-time mother was a young heifer, skittish and uncertain, and her baby was weak from not nursing properly. Clay spent an hour coaxing the calf to latch, holding the heifer steady while the baby fed. His shoulders ached by the time he finished, and the sky had grown darker, the smell of rain stronger. When he returned to the cabin, Mara had moved inside and was inventorying the pantry with the methodical focus of a quartermaster preparing for siege. She'd found paper and pencil somewhere, his, probably, from the shelf where he kept his ledger, and was making notes in small, precise handwriting. "Flour's low," she said without looking up. "Sugar, too. You've got coffee for maybe 2 more weeks if you're drinking it like you were this morning. Salt's adequate. No yeast I can find, which means no bread unless I start a sourdough culture. Do you have vinegar? Should be a jug in the cellar. I'll check. What about fabric? Thread? I saw the mending basket. There's work there that needs doing before winter unless you want to freeze through worn-out clothes." Clay leaned against the doorframe, watching her move through his supplies with the efficient grace of someone who'd learned to make much from little. "There's a dry goods store in Miles City. Mrs. Chen runs it. She keeps fair prices." "How often do you go to town?" "Once a month, usually. Sometimes less if weather's bad or work's heavy." Mara made another note on her paper. "We'll need to go soon then, before the list gets longer than we can afford." "We?" She looked up at him then, her expression careful. "Unless you'd rather I stayed here. I just thought, the children and I should know the way in case there's ever need, and Mrs. Chen might have opinions on what sells best at market, what preserves folks actually buy instead of making their own." Clay hadn't thought that far ahead, hadn't considered that Mara might want to earn money separate from his ranch work, that she might be planning for independence even while living under his roof. It rankled briefly, pride prickling at the suggestion that his providing might not be enough. Then he remembered her words from the night before. "I won't be a burden." "Town's a day's ride there and back," he said. "We'd need to leave early, make it home before dark." "The children can manage a long ride." "You sure about that?" "They've managed worse." She said it simply, without elaboration, but Clay heard the weight behind the words. Whatever those twins had survived before Mara took them in, it had taught them endurance beyond their years. "All right," he said. 2 days from now, weather permitting. That'll give you time to finish your list." Mara nodded and returned to her inventory. Clay watched for another moment, then headed outside to split wood. The physical labor felt good after the frustration of the morning's fence inspection, the steady rhythm of axe falling on log, wood splitting clean, the pile growing higher. He worked until his shoulders burned and sweat soaked through his shirt despite the cool air. When he finally stopped, chest heaving, he found Luke standing at the edge of the woodpile, watching with those too careful eyes. "You need something?" Clay asked, trying to gentle his voice despite his breathlessness. Luke shook his head but didn't leave. Just stood there, small and thin, in clothes that had been mended too many times, staring at the axe like it was something both fascinating and dangerous. "You ever split wood before?" Clay asked. Another headshake. "Want to learn?" For the first time, something other than wariness crossed the boy's face, a flicker of interest, quickly suppressed, like he'd learned not to want things too openly. "It's all right if you do," Clay said. "Useful skill. Every man ought to know how to split his own firewood." Luke glanced back toward the cabin, where Mara was visible through the window. She must have nodded or given some signal Clay couldn't see, because the boy turned back and took a small step closer. "All right then." Clay picked up a smaller piece of wood, set it on the stump he used as a splitting block. "First thing you need to know is the axe is a tool, not a toy. You respect it, and it'll serve you well. You get careless, it'll hurt you bad." He demonstrated the grip, the stance, the way to let the weight of the axe head do most of the work. Luke watched with absolute focus, absorbing every detail. "Your turn." Clay held out the axe, handle first. Luke took it with both hands. The tool was too big for him, too heavy, but he lifted it gamely, his whole body straining with effort. "Not like that. Here." Clay moved behind him, adjusted his grip, helped him feel the balance. "Let the weight fall. Don't force it. Just guide it where you want it to go." Together they swung the axe down. It bit into the wood without splitting it, not enough force behind the blow, but Luke's face lit up with something close to pride. "Good," Clay said. "Again." They practiced until Luke's arms were shaking and the log had a dozen shallow cuts but remained stubbornly whole. Finally, Clay took the axe back and split the wood himself with one clean stroke. "Takes time to build the strength for it," he said. "But you've got the idea. Practice enough, and you'll be doing it yourself before long." Luke nodded, solemn as a judge. Then, so quietly, Clay almost missed it. Thank you. The words hit harder than they should have. This small boy, thanking him for a few minutes of patience, like kindness was something rare and noteworthy instead of something children should be able to expect. You're welcome, Clay managed. Now go on inside before your aunt starts worrying. Luke ran back to the cabin, his thin legs pumping, and disappeared through the door. Clay stood alone with his axe and his growing woodpile, feeling the weight of responsibility settling heavier on his shoulders. These children weren't his. This woman wasn't really his wife, not in any way that counted beyond paper and law. He'd taken them in because sending them back had seemed crueler than the alternative, because something in Mara's straight spine and steady eyes had demanded respect instead of pity. But somewhere between last night's awkward vows and this moment, standing in his woodlot with sawdust on his boots and a child's quiet gratitude still echoing in his ears, the arrangement had started feeling less like charity and more like something he couldn't quite name yet. The rain started as he was stacking the last of the split wood. Cold drops, heavy and insistent, turning the dirt to mud and sending the chickens scurrying for shelter. Clay grabbed an armload of wood and ran for the cabin, shouldering through the door just as the sky opened up in earnest. Inside, Mara had lit the lamps against the sudden darkness. The twins sat at the table with the slate Clay used for figuring accounts, practicing letters under Mara's quiet instruction. The scene was so domestic, so utterly normal, that it stopped Clay in his tracks. This was his cabin, his table, his lamp oil burning to light the room. But these people, this family, they were transforming the space just by occupying it, making it feel less like a shelter and more like a place where life happened. Getting bad out there? Mara asked, glancing up from the slate. Coming down hard. We're in for a wet night. Good for the garden, at least. Clay set down the wood beside the stove, brushing bark and splinters from his shirt. I'll need to check the animals before dark. Make sure everything's secured. I'll have supper ready when you get back. He nodded and pulled his coat back on, already damp from the brief run between woodpile and cabin. The rain was cold enough to make his teeth chatter, and the wind had picked up, driving the drops horizontal across the pasture. The cattle had found shelter in the lee of the ridge, huddled together with their backs to the wind. The horses were in the barn, dry and unbothered. Clay checked the chickens last. They'd all made it to the coop, the crooked door swinging in the wind but holding. He'd have to fix that soon, add it to the growing list of tasks that never quite got finished. By the time he made it back to the cabin, he was soaked through and shivering. Mara took one look at him and pointed to the bedroom. Dry clothes, now, before you catch your death. I'm fine. You're dripping on the floor you made me wash this morning. Dry clothes, Clay. I mean it. There was steel under the quiet words, the tone of someone who'd learned to give orders and expect them followed. Clay found himself obeying without further argument, retreating to the bedroom to change into clothes that weren't plastered to his skin. When he emerged, Mara had hot coffee waiting and a plate of cornbread and beans that somehow tasted better than when he made them himself. The twins had been fed already and were sitting close to the stove, listening to the rain hammer the roof. Storm like this could last all night, Clay said between bites. Roof hold? Should. I patched it last fall. Should isn't will. No, Clay agreed, but it's the best I can promise. They ate in companionable silence, the storm providing all the conversation they needed. When the meal was finished, Mara cleared the dishes and the twins returned to their corner, settling against each other like puppies seeking warmth. Within minutes, both were asleep, Luke's head on Lila's shoulder, her arm around his waist. They always sleep like that? Clay asked quietly. Since their mother died. Sometimes I find them in the same bed even when there's two available. I think they're afraid if they separate, one of them might disappear. Clay thought about his own siblings, the ones who'd lived past infancy. He'd been close to his brother once before a logging accident took him at 14. Understood the fear of loss, the way it made you hold tighter to what remained. How long were you with them before their mother passed? 3 years. I came to help when their father died. My sister couldn't manage alone with 2 babies. Then the influenza came through. Mara's voice stayed level, but her hands stilled on the dish she was drying. She fought it for a week. Toward the end, when she knew she wasn't going to make it, she made me promise I'd keep them together. No orphanage, no splitting them up to different families. Together, no matter what. That's why you answered my advertisement. That's why. Chicago was getting expensive. Work was scarce. I couldn't keep us fed and housed much longer on what I was earning. Then I saw your notice in the matrimonial listings. She set down the dish, turned to face him. I did write that letter, Clay, about the children. I posted it the same day I confirmed I'd come. I swear I didn't mean to deceive you. I believe you. Do you? Clay considered the question honestly. Yeah, I do. You're not a liar, Mara. You're just someone who ran out of better options. We're a pair then, both of us making do with what's left. The rain intensified, drumming so hard on the roof the conversation became difficult. Clay banked the fire for the night while Mara gathered the sleeping children, carrying them one at a time to the bedroom. When she emerged, pulling the door closed behind her, she looked exhausted, the kind of bone-deep tired that came from carrying too much for too long. You should sleep, Clay said. So should you. I will. Just want to listen to the storm a bit longer. Make sure the roof's holding like I said. Mara studied him in the lamplight, her expression unreadable. Then she did something unexpected. She sat down at the table across from him, folding her hands on the worn wood surface. Can I ask you something? Sure. Why did you really marry me yesterday? And don't say it was because the boarding house was full. We both know that wasn't true. Clay felt heat climb his neck. He'd thought the lie had been convincing, or at least convincing enough that she wouldn't call him on it. Does it matter? He asked finally. It might. I need to know if you're going to regret it, if one morning I'm going to wake up and find you've decided this was a mistake and we need to leave. That won't happen. How can you be sure? Clay looked at her, really looked, taking in the straight spine that never seemed to bend, the calloused hands folded so carefully, the eyes that had probably seen too much but refused to look away from more. He thought about the twins sleeping in his bedroom, about Luke's careful thanks for a few minutes of patience, about Mara reorganizing his pantry and planning for a winter he'd been dreading alone. My father used to say that a man judges his worth by what he builds, Clay said slowly. I spent 15 years building this ranch. Good land, decent herd, cabin that keeps out most of the weather. I was proud of it, thought it was enough. He paused, searching for words that didn't come easy. Then you stepped off that train with those children, and I realized what I'd built was just survival, not a life. Not really. So we're what then? A project? Something else to build? No. Clay shook his head. You're people who need a place to be, and I've got a place that needs people in it. Maybe that's not love or romance or any of the things the songs talk about, but it's honest, it's real, and it's more than I had yesterday. Mara was quiet for a long time, her gaze dropping to her hands. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft, almost lost under the rain. I can work with honest. I can work with real. It's the pretty lies I can't stomach anymore. Then we understand each other. I think maybe we do. The lamp flickered, oil running low. Clay stood to trim the wick, but Mara rose too, placing her hand briefly on his arm. Thank you, she said, for telling me the truth. Then she was gone, retreating to the bedroom and closing the door behind her, leaving Clay alone with the dying lamp and the relentless rain and the strange, unsettled feeling that his life had just shifted in ways he couldn't fully comprehend yet. He climbed to the loft eventually, spreading his bedroll on boards that seemed harder than they'd been the night before. Sleep came slowly, troubled by dreams of storms and children's eyes, and a woman's voice asking questions he didn't have answers for. When he woke, the rain had stopped, but the world outside was soaked through and dripping. He descended to find Mara already up, coffee brewing, moving through his kitchen like she'd been doing it for years instead of days. Morning, she said quietly. Morning. They fell into the rhythm of the day, breakfast, chores, the endless work that defined life on a Montana ranch. But something had changed between them in the night, some barrier lowered just slightly, making the silence less awkward and the shared space less strange. By the time the sun broke through the clouds mid-morning, Clay realized he was humming while he worked, the first time he'd done that in longer than he could remember. And when he glanced back at the cabin, He saw Mara in the doorway with the twins beside her, watching him cross the muddy yard, and felt something in his chest shift and settle like a foundation finding solid ground at last. The days that followed developed their own rhythm, shaped by necessity and the relentless demands of the land. Clay rose before dawn each morning to find Mara already moving through the cabin, coffee brewing, the stove radiating heat against the pre-dawn chill. They worked in tandem without needing to speak much, him heading out to check stock and mend fences, her organizing the chaos he'd been living in for too long, while the twins helped with tasks suited to small hands. By the third morning, Clay found himself timing his return to the cabin to coincide with breakfast, drawn by the smell of frying bacon and the knowledge that someone would notice if he didn't show up. It was a small thing, that noticing, but it filled a hollow place he hadn't known was empty. On the fourth day, Mara's list was complete. She handed it to Clay after breakfast. 2 full pages of items written in that precise hand, organized by category and priority. He read through it slowly, mentally calculating costs against the dwindling account he kept at the Miles City Bank. "This is ambitious," he said finally. "It's necessary. You can cut whatever you need to, but that's what it'll take to get us through winter without starving or freezing." Clay folded the paper and tucked it into his shirt pocket. "We'll leave tomorrow. Dawn, can you and the children be ready?" "We'll be ready." The twins looked up from where they sat, mending a torn grain sack under Mara's instruction, their eyes wide with an emotion Clay was learning to read. Not quite fear, but close to it, the wariness of children who'd learned that changes usually meant losses. "It's all right," Mara told them quietly. "Just a trip to town. We'll come back before dark." "Promise?" Lila's voice was barely a whisper, the first time Clay had heard her speak directly. Mara knelt beside her, cupping the girl's small face in both hands. "I promise. We're not leaving. This is home now." The words settled something in Clay's chest that had been restless since the moment he'd agreed to this arrangement. Home. Not just his place, not just shelter, but home. Shared and claimed and real. That afternoon, a wind came howling down from the mountains, carrying the scent of pine and the promise of early cold. Clay was checking the hinges on the barn door when he heard it, a sound that didn't belong, wrong enough that it stopped him mid-motion. A high-pitched yelping, frantic and afraid, coming from somewhere beyond the chicken coop. He grabbed a shovel from the barn wall and ran toward the sound, his boots sliding in the mud still wet from the previous night's rain. Behind the coop, he found the source. A fox, rust-colored and desperate, its front paw caught in the gap where 2 boards had warped and separated. The animal thrashed and snarled, foam at its mouth, eyes wild with panic and pain. Clay approached carefully, keeping the shovel between himself and the fox's snapping jaws. The animal was young, lean from a hard season, and utterly committed to taking a piece out of anything that came close. He could kill it easily, should kill it, really, given that a fox this close to the coop meant trouble for his chickens, but something about its fierce determination to survive made him hesitate. "What are you doing to yourself?" he muttered, studying the trap the fox had made of the gap. The paw was wedged tight, probably swelling already, and the more the animal pulled, the worse it got. Behind him, footsteps approached through the mud. Clay glanced back to find Mara coming around the corner of the coop, the twins trailing close behind her. "Stay back," he said sharply. "It's panicked. Could have rabies." Mara stopped but didn't retreat. Her eyes assessed the situation with the same practical focus she brought to everything. "Doesn't look rabid, just scared and hurt." "Same thing can kill you." "You gonna put it down?" Clay looked at the fox again, at its bared teeth and terrified eyes, at the way it kept fighting, even though fighting only made things worse. He thought about the chickens he needed to protect, about the practical choice that made sense. "Probably should," he said, "but you're not going to." It wasn't a question. Somehow this woman he'd known less than a week could already read him better than people he'd lived near for years. "Hand me those leather gloves from the barn," he said, "the heavy ones." Mara sent Luke running for them. When the boy returned, Clay pulled on the thick gloves and set down the shovel. The fox watched him with black eyes, calculating, its whole body tensed for the next attack. "This is stupid," Clay said to no one in particular. "This is how a man gets bit and ends up dying of infection or worse." "Then why do it?" Mara asked. because leaving it to die slow seems meaner than getting bit. He moved fast, grabbing the fox behind the head with one hand while using the other to pry at the boards. The animal twisted and fought, its teeth seeking purchase through the leather, its claws raking furrows in the glove material. Clay gritted his teeth and worked the boards apart, feeling wood splinter under his grip. The gap widened. The fox's paw came free. For one heartbeat, Clay held a wild thing in his hands, muscle and fury, an absolute commitment to survival. Then he released it, throwing himself backward as the fox scrambled away. It ran 20 feet, stopped, looked back at them with what might have been confusion or might have been nothing more than animal assessment. Then it vanished into the tall grass beyond the fence line, moving with a limp but moving nonetheless. Clay sat in the mud, breathing hard, examining his gloves for tears. The leather had held, barely. His hands were shaking slightly from adrenaline. "That was the dumbest thing I've seen in a while," Mara said. But there was something in her voice that wasn't criticism. "Yeah, well," Clay pulled off the gloves, tossed them aside. "Probably won't see that particular fox around here again. They're smart enough to remember where trouble lives." Luke was staring at the spot where the fox had disappeared, his small face alight with something that looked almost like wonder. "You saved it!" "I let it go. That's different from saving it." "No, it's not." The boy's voice was firm, certain in the way only children could be certain. "It was trapped, and you made it free. That's saving." Clay stood, brushing mud from his pants, unsure how to respond to the weight the boy was putting on a simple decision. It had just been a fox, just an animal that would probably end up shot or trapped by someone else before winter came. Nothing worth the reverence he heard in Luke's voice. But when he looked at Mara, he saw her watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read, something softer than her usual careful assessment, something that made him think maybe she understood what Luke was seeing that Clay himself couldn't. "Come on," he said gruffly. "That coop door needs fixing properly before we've got foxes coming and going like they own the place." He spent the rest of the afternoon rebuilding the section of coop where the boards had warped, planing new pieces to fit tight and secure. Luke stayed close, handing him nails when asked, watching every movement with that same focused attention he'd shown during the wood-splitting lesson. Clay found himself explaining what he was doing and why, the words coming easier than he'd expected. "You always want your corners square," he said, checking his work with a level. "Otherwise, the whole structure's fighting itself, trying to twist into shapes it wasn't meant to hold." "Like people?" Luke asked. "Ook?" Clay paused, hammer raised. "What do you mean?" "Aunt Mara says sometimes people get pushed into shapes that don't fit. That's when they break." The observation was too old for a 5-year-old, too knowing. Clay wondered what this boy had seen, what shapes he'd been pushed into before Mara took him in. "Your aunt's a wise woman," he said finally. "You listen to what she tells you." "I do. She's never lied to me." "That's good. That's important." They worked in silence after that, but it was a comfortable silence, broken only by the sound of hammer on nail and the wind moving through the grass. When the repair was complete, Clay stood back to examine his work. The coop was secure now, tight enough that nothing short of a determined bear would get through. "Good job," he told Luke. "You were real helpful today." The boy's face lit up like Clay had handed him something precious. "Can I help tomorrow too?" "If your aunt says it's all right, and if you've done your lessons first." Luke nodded seriously and ran back toward the cabin where Lila sat on the porch steps with Mara, both of them shelling peas into a bowl. Clay gathered his tools and followed more slowly, watching the scene from a distance. Mara's patient hands showing Lila how to split the pods just right. The girl's careful imitation, the pile of empty shells growing beside the bowl of peas. Domestic and ordinary and somehow more settling than anything Clay had experienced in years. That evening, after a supper of fried pork and the peas they'd shelled, Mara pulled out a piece of cloth she'd been keeping folded in her bag. Rough muslin, worn soft from washing, with faded pencil marks forming the outline of something Clay couldn't quite make out. "What's that?" he asked. "A map. I've been teaching the twins geography, but all we've had is this, a sketch I made from memory of the eastern states." She spread it on the table, smoothing the creases. "It's not much, but it helps them understand where we came from, how far we've traveled." Clay studied the crude map. recognizing the general shapes of states he'd passed through on his own journey west years ago. Illinois and Iowa, Missouri and Kansas, the territories beyond. Mara had marked Chicago with a small X, and a dotted line showed their route westward. "You could add Montana," he said. "Show them where they are now." "I don't know the territory well enough. The shapes, the rivers, the mountains." She looked at him, questioning. "Do you?" Clay did, actually. He'd spent his first years in Montana learning the land like a language, memorizing landmarks and water sources and the way valleys ran between ridges. He could draw it from memory better than most maps he'd seen. "I could sketch it," he offered. "If you want." Mara's face brightened with something that might have been pleasure or might have been relief. The twins would like that. They've been asking about the mountains, where they came from, how high they go, what's beyond them. So Clay found himself at the table after the dishes were washed, with the twins pressed close on either side and Mara across from him, drawing the rough outline of Montana territory on a fresh piece of muslin Mara had produced from somewhere. He marked the Missouri River, the Yellowstone, the tongue-like shape of the river that gave this country its name. He drew the mountain ranges, Crazy Mountains to the west, Bighorns to the south, the smaller ranges that cut through the grasslands. He marked Miles City with a small circle and the ranch with an X. "We're here," he said, tapping the X. "These are the Tongue River breaks, all around us. Good grazing land, decent water, shelter from the worst winds." "What's beyond the mountains?" Lila asked, her finger tracing the western edge of his map. "More mountains, then valleys, then the big peaks that stay white all year. Beyond that, eventually the ocean." "Have you seen it? The ocean?" "No, never been that far west." "Will we go someday?" The question caught Clay off guard. The casual assumption that there would be some days, plural and stretching into a future this girl could imagine sharing with him. He glanced at Mara, found her watching him with that careful expression again. "Maybe," he said. "It's a long way, though, month's journey or more." "That's okay," Lila said simply. "We're not in a hurry." After the children were settled for the night, Clay and Mara sat together at the table with the map still spread between them. She traced the route they'd taken from Chicago, her finger moving slowly westward. "I didn't tell them how scared I was," she said quietly. "Getting on that train with everything we owned in one bag and no certainty about what waited at the other end. I just kept telling them it would be an adventure, that we were going to build a new life." "Sounds like you believed it." "I had to. They were watching me for cues about whether to be excited or terrified. If I'd let them see my fear, they'd have drowned in it." She looked up at him. "Do you ever get scared, Clay? About the ranch? About whether you can hold it together through another winter?" He wanted to say no, wanted to project the kind of steady confidence a man was supposed to carry. But something about the lamplight and the late hour and the honesty in her question made lying feel impossible. "Every year," he admitted. "Every time the first snow comes and I'm taking inventory of what I've got stored against what I'll need. Every time a cow goes down sick or a fence breaks in a storm. Every time I'm riding the range alone and thinking about how long it might take someone to find me if my horse threw me and I broke something important." "But you stay anyway?" "Where else would I go? This is all I've built. All I've got." Mara nodded slowly, understanding in a way that most people wouldn't. "That's how I felt in Chicago. Like I couldn't leave because then what would I be? Just a woman with 2 children and no prospects and no place to belong. At least there I had work, had a room, had something. But you left anyway, because something isn't enough when you can see it running out. I could feel it coming. The day when the rent would be more than I earned, when the children would need things I couldn't provide, when the whole fragile structure would collapse." She looked down at her hands, weathered from work that never seemed to end. Coming here was terrifying, but staying was worse. Clay thought about his own departure from Pennsylvania, the farm he'd left behind, and the father who'd barely said goodbye. The way he'd ridden west with nothing but stubbornness and a hunger for something that was his and his alone. How that hunger had driven him for 15 years, through hard winters and failed crops and loneliness that sometimes felt like it would crush him. How he'd built this ranch board by board, fence post by fence post, telling himself it was enough. "I'm glad you came," he said. The words felt inadequate, too small for what he meant. but they were true. Mara met his eyes across the table. So am I. The moment stretched between them, weighted with things neither quite knew how to say. Then Mara stood, folding the map carefully, and the spell broke. We should sleep. Early start tomorrow if we're making town and back in one day. Yeah. Clay rose too, moving toward the ladder to the loft. Mara? She paused, turned back. You're doing good with them, the twins. They're lucky to have you. Something flickered across her face, pain maybe, or old grief briefly surfacing. I'm the one who's lucky. They gave me a reason to keep trying when I didn't have anything left for myself. She disappeared into the bedroom before he could respond, leaving Clay alone with the dying lamp and the understanding that this woman he'd married was stronger than he'd realized, had survived losses he could only guess at, and was still choosing every day to build instead of break. He lay in the loft a long time before sleep came, listening to the night sounds and thinking about foxes that wouldn't quit fighting even when fighting only made things worse. Dawn came cold and clear, the sky washed clean by the recent rains and painted in shades of pink and gold. Clay loaded the wagon while Mara dressed the twins in their best clothes, which wasn't saying much, but at least the mending she'd done made them look cared for instead of ragged. She'd done something to her own appearance too, pinned her hair neater, worn the dress that had the fewest patches. You don't have to impress anyone in Miles City, Clay said as he helped her into the wagon seat. I'm not trying to impress. I'm trying not to embarrass you. You couldn't. Not possible. She looked at him sharply, like she was trying to determine if he meant it. Whatever she saw in his face must have satisfied her, because she nodded and settled into the seat with the twins pressed close on either side. The ride to town took most of the morning, the wagon rolling through country that was beautiful in its starkness. Endless grass rippling like water, distant mountains purple against the sky, hawks circling on thermals high overhead. The twins started out nervous, jumping at every unexpected sound, but gradually the wonder of it all overtook their wariness. Luke peppered Clay with questions about everything they passed. What kind of bird was that? Why did the grass grow so tall here? Were those really buffalo wallows or just regular holes? Clay answered each question as best he could, surprised by how much he'd absorbed about this land without consciously studying it. Mara listened without interrupting, occasionally adding details he missed, and slowly Clay began to understand they were both teaching these children the same lesson, that this place, harsh as it was, could be learned and understood and even loved if you paid attention. Miles City appeared as a cluster of buildings shimmering in the heat, the Tongue River cutting silver through the valley beside it. They came in from the North Road, passing scattered homesteads and fields where crops struggled against the dry soil. The town itself was bigger than when Clay had first arrived 8 years ago. More buildings, more people, the kind of growth that came when the railroad connected a place to the wider world. Clay drove straight to the general store, pulling the wagon up at the hitching rail. Mrs. Chen was on the porch, rearranging a display of canned goods, and she looked up with interest when she saw Clay wasn't alone. Mr. Hartman, she said, her accent carrying the music of Canton, though she'd been in Montana longer than Clay had. I heard you'd gone and gotten yourself a wife. News travels, Clay said, helping Mara down from the wagon. In this town? Faster than telegraph. Mrs. Chen's sharp eyes took in Mara, the twins, the whole picture they made. I'm Lily Chen. My husband and I run the store. Mara Hartman. Mara's voice was steady, polite, carrying no apology for her existence or her circumstances. These are my niece and nephew, Lila and Luke. Mrs. Chen's expression softened when she looked at the children. Well now, aren't you two the quiet ones? Come inside. I have peppermint sticks that need eating before they get old. Inside, the store was packed floor to ceiling with supplies, barrels of flour and sugar, bolts of fabric, tools hanging from rafters, patent medicines and colored bottles, everything a person might need to survive in country that didn't offer second chances. Mr. Chen emerged from the back room, wiping his hands on his apron, and nodded to Clay in greeting. You have a list? He asked. Clay pulled out Mara's carefully written pages and handed them over. Mr. Chen read through them with professional efficiency, making notes on a separate paper. This is good planning, he said. Very thorough. Your wife knows how to prepare for winter." "She does," Clay agreed, feeling an odd pride in Mara's competence. While Mr. Chen began gathering items, Mrs. Chen took Mara aside, speaking quietly but with the kind of practical directness that Clay had always appreciated about her. He couldn't hear everything they said, but he caught enough. Advice about what sold well at the weekend market, which fabrics would hold up to hard use, how to make a little money go a long way. Mara listened intently, occasionally asking questions, her mind clearly working through possibilities and calculations. The twins, meanwhile, had accepted their peppermint sticks and were exploring the store with wide eyes, taking in wonders they probably hadn't seen since leaving Chicago. Clay watched Luke pause before a display of carved wooden toys, horses and wagons and small figures no bigger than a child's thumb. The boy's hand reached out, stopped just short of touching, pulled back. Clay moved closer. "You like those?" Luke nodded without speaking, his eyes fixed on a small carved horse. "Mr. Chen makes them himself. Sells them to miners' kids mostly, folks passing through." Clay picked up the horse, feeling the smoothness of the wood, the care that had gone into the carving. It cost more than he wanted to spend on something that wasn't strictly necessary, but watching Luke's face as he stared at it made the decision simple. "We'll take this one," he told Mr. Chen when they approached the counter with their loaded cart. Luke's head whipped around. "But no arguments. A boy should have at least one toy that's his and his alone." He saw Mara watching from across the store, her expression unreadable, but her eyes bright with something that might have been gratitude or might have been something deeper. She turned away before he could be sure, returning her attention to the conversation with Mrs. Chen. The bill came to more than Clay had budgeted, but less than he'd feared. He paid with cash and a promise to settle the remaining balance after he sold steers in the fall. Mr. Chen accepted the arrangement without complaint. They'd been doing business long enough that credit meant something. Reputation counted for collateral. While Mr. Chen was loading the supplies into the wagon, Mara approached with a small bundle wrapped in brown paper. "Mrs. Chen helped me pick fabric for new shirts for the twins," she said, "and she's taking 3 jars of my preserves on consignment. If they sell, she'll take more. I can use my half of the proceeds to buy the materials for winter clothes without touching your account." Clay looked at the bundle, then at Mara's face, proud but nervous, waiting to see if he'd object to her making arrangements without consulting him first. "That's good thinking," he said. "Smart business." Her shoulders relaxed slightly. "Mrs. Chen says if I can make enough preserves before fall, she'll buy them outright for the winter stock. $1 a jar for anything that's not plain berry." "How many jars would you need to make?" 100, maybe more, which means we need fruit and vegetables to process, and sugar, and new rings for the mason jars. Add it to the account. If Mrs. Chen's willing to pay $1 a jar, that's income we can use." Mara nodded, already calculating in that way she had. Clay could almost see her mental ledger, income against expenses, profit margins measured in pennies, the careful arithmetic of survival. They were more alike than he'd realized, he and this woman from Chicago. Both of them counting costs, measuring risks, building something sustainable from whatever materials they could gather. They left Miles City just after noon, the wagon heavier now with supplies that would see them through the coming months if they were careful. The twins had fallen asleep in the back, exhausted by the morning's excitement, Luke still clutching his carved horse. Clay and Mara rode in comfortable silence for the first few miles. Then she spoke, her voice quiet enough that it wouldn't wake the children. "Mrs. Chen told me something." "Yeah?" "She said you're respected in this town, that people know you as a man who keeps his word and doesn't cheat his neighbors. She said I was lucky to have married you." Clay shifted uncomfortably on the wagon seat. "Mrs. Chen's generous with her opinions. She also said you've been alone too long, that she's glad you finally decided to do something about it." Mara was quiet for a moment. "She asked if I was going to be enough for you." "What did you tell her?" "That I didn't know yet. That we were still figuring each other out." Mara glanced at him sideways. "What would you have said?" Clay thought about it, about the week they'd spent learning each other's rhythms, about Mara's competence and quiet strength, about the way the cabin felt different now, with voices filling it, about this morning, watching her take charge of her own small business arrangement with the confidence of someone who knew her own worth. "I'd have said you're already more than I expected," he told her. More than I probably deserve. Don't do that. Do what? Talk like you're not worth much. Like you should be grateful someone was willing to show up. Her voice carried an edge now, something sharp under the softness. You gave us a home when you could have sent us back. You've been patient with the children. You've treated me like a partner instead of property. That's worth something, Clay. That's worth a lot. The words hit harder than they should have, finding places in Clay that were still tender from years of building alone, working toward goals no one else cared about, measuring his worth by what he could accomplish rather than who he was. He'd gotten used to thinking of himself as sufficient, capable enough, strong enough, but never quite enough to deserve the softer things other people seemed to find naturally. I'm trying, he said finally. I don't always know how to do this, the family part, but I'm trying. I know you are. So am I. Mara's hand found his on the wagon seat, covered it briefly with her own. The touch was light, careful, but deliberate. We'll figure it out together. That's what partners do. Clay nodded, not trusting his voice. They rode on through the afternoon heat, through country that was theirs now in a way that felt different from mere ownership. Shared, claimed, home. When the ranch came into view as the sun dropped low, Clay felt something settle in his chest that had been restless for as long as he could remember. The cabin looked smaller than when he'd left it that morning, more humble. Just 3 rooms and a lean-to barn and fences that needed constant mending. But smoke would rise from that chimney come winter, and voices would fill those rooms, and work would be divided among willing hands instead of falling only on his. He'd come west looking to build something that couldn't be taken away. He'd succeeded in that, carved out land and shelter that were his by law and labor. But what Mara and the twins brought, the life that made a house into a home, that was something he couldn't have built alone no matter how hard he'd worked or how long he'd tried. As Clay pulled the wagon up beside the cabin and set the brake, Luke stirred in the back and sat up, blinking sleepily. "We're home," he asked, his voice small and uncertain despite Mara's promise from the day before. "We're home," Clay confirmed, and saying it out loud, watching the boy's face relax into something that might have been relief or might have been the beginning of trust, Clay realized he meant it in ways that went deeper than geography or property lines. This was home now, for all of them. And whatever storms came, because they would come, as certain as winter, they'd face them together instead of alone. That was worth more than all the careful planning and hard work in the world. The weeks that followed the trip to town fell into a pattern that felt less like routine and more like the slow construction of something lasting. July burned hot and dry across the Tongue River country, the grass turning gold under relentless sun, the creek running lower each day. Clay worked from first light until the heat drove him to shade, then worked again when evening brought relief. But now when he came in from the pastures, there was always water waiting, a meal being prepared, voices that greeted his arrival instead of silence. Mara threw herself into preserving with the focused intensity of someone who understood that survival depended on preparation. She rose even earlier than Clay, heading to the garden before the heat became unbearable, harvesting what was ready and planning what would come next. The twins worked alongside her, their small hands learning to distinguish weeds from vegetables, to recognize when fruit was ripe enough to pick. Clay built her a work table outside under the cottonwood tree, a solid structure that could handle the weight of filled canning pots and bushel baskets of produce. He watched her transform the raw materials of summer into jars of jewel-toned preserves, wild plum jam from the thickets along the creek, pickled beans from the garden, tomatoes put up whole in their own juice. She worked with an efficiency that spoke of long practice, her hands moving through the familiar motions while her mind clearly ran ahead to the next task, the next problem to solve. By mid-July, she had 40 jars sealed and cooling on the cabin shelves. By August, over 70. The pantry that had been half empty when she arrived now showed the promise of abundance, rows of glass catching lamplight like captured sunlight stored against the coming dark. On a Tuesday morning when the heat was already oppressive by breakfast, Clay was mending harness in the barn when he heard Lila scream. Not the startled yelp of a child surprised by a spider, but a real scream, high and terrified and cut short too quickly. He dropped the leather and ran, his heart hammering against his ribs. He found the twins near the chicken coop, Luke standing frozen, and Lila crumpled on the ground, her leg twisted wrong beneath her, her face white with shock and pain. What happened? Clay dropped to his knees beside her, his hands already checking for breaks, for blood, for whatever had caused that scream. The rooster, Luke whispered. It went after her, and she fell running away. Clay found the injury quickly, Lila's ankle already swelling, turning colors that promised serious damage. She'd landed hard on a rock embedded in the dirt, the kind of fall that could break bones in a child so small. "Where's Mara?" he asked, keeping his voice calm despite the adrenaline singing through his veins. "Creek, getting water. Run and get her, fast as you can. Tell her to bring clean cloth." Luke took off running, his thin legs pumping. Clay gathered Lila carefully, trying not to jostle the injured ankle, and carried her to the cabin. She didn't cry, which worried him more than tears would have. She just clutched his shirt with white-knuckled hands and made small, hurt sounds in the back of her throat. Inside, he settled her on the bed as gently as possible and pulled off her shoe. Cheap canvas, worn through at the toe, barely adequate protection even on a good day. The ankle beneath was already grotesquely swollen, angry purple, spreading up from the joint. Mara burst through the door with Luke behind her, her face gone pale under the summer tan. She took one look at Lila's ankle, and her expression shifted from fear to focused determination. "Get me cold water from the well," she told Clay, "and find something we can use as a splint. Nothing too heavy. She's going to have to keep weight off this for weeks." Clay did as instructed, hauling water and searching through his supplies for anything that might work. He came back with thin strips of wood from a broken crate and the coldest water the well could provide. Mara had already cut away Lila's stocking, exposing the full extent of the damage. "I need to check if it's broken," she said quietly, her hands hovering over the swollen flesh. "This is going to hurt, sweetheart. I'm sorry." She worked with careful precision, her fingers probing the joint, while Lila bit down on a leather strap Mara had given her. Clay watched, helpless and useless, as Mara examined every angle of the injury. Finally, she sat back, relief evident in the set of her shoulders. Not broken, bad sprain, but the bones intact. She looked up at Clay. "We need to get the swelling down, then immobilize it. She'll need to stay off it completely for at least 2 weeks, maybe 3. What do you need from me?" "Keep that water cold. We'll alternate cold compresses with willow bark tea for the pain, and I'll need those splints wrapped in cloth so they don't chafe." They worked together through the morning, Clay following Mara's instructions while she tended to Lila with the practiced competence of someone who dealt with injuries before. She made tea from willow bark she'd harvested and dried weeks ago, planning ahead in ways Clay hadn't even thought to appreciate. She fashioned a compress that she changed every 20 minutes, keeping the ankle cold to fight the swelling. She sang to Lila in a low voice, old songs that seemed to come from some deep place of memory, while her hands stayed busy with the work of healing. By afternoon, the worst of the swelling had stopped spreading. Mara splinted the ankle carefully, wrapping it tight enough to provide support, but not so tight it would cut off circulation. Lila had finally fallen into exhausted sleep, her small face still pinched with pain even in unconsciousness. Clay and Mara sat at the table while Luke dozed in the corner, worn out from worry and the heat. The cabin was stifling despite opened windows, the air thick and still. "Where did you learn to do that?" Clay asked quietly. "Treat injuries like that?" "Chicago. The tenement where we lived, people couldn't afford doctors for every little thing. You learned to handle what you could yourself, or you went without." Mara's hands were wrapped around a cup of water, her knuckles white with tension that hadn't released despite the immediate crisis passing. "My sister broke her wrist once, falling on ice. I was the one who set it, wrapped it, kept her from using it until it healed. She used to joke I'd missed my calling as a nurse." "You would have been good at it." "Maybe. But being good at something and being allowed to do it are different things. Women like me, we don't get to choose our callings. We just do what's necessary and hope it's enough." Clay thought about that, about the ways Mara's life had been constrained by circumstance and expectation, about the skills she'd developed not by choice but by need, about how much competence the world wasted by deciding in advance what people were capable of based on their sex or their station. "She's lucky you're here," he said. "That ankle. If you hadn't known what to do." "But I did know, and she'll be fine. Children heal fast if you give them the chance." Mara finally looked at him, her eyes tired but clear. You did good too, Clay. Staying calm, following instructions, not panicking. Some men would have insisted on doing it their way, or rushed her to town even though the ride would have made it worse. I trust you. When you know better than me, I'm smart enough to listen. Something shifted in Mara's expression, a softening around her eyes. That's rarer than you think. Most men would rather be right than smart. Most men are fools then. She almost smiled at that, a ghost of humor breaking through the worry. Yeah, they are. Over the next 2 weeks, the cabin reorganized itself around Lila's injury. Clay built a padded chair where she could sit with her leg elevated, and Mara created a routine of exercises and massage to keep the muscles from atrophying. Luke became his sister's constant companion, reading to her from the few books they had, playing quiet games, keeping her spirits up through the boredom of forced stillness. Clay found himself drawn into their world more than before. He'd come in from work to find Luke and Lila arranging his carved horse and rocks and sticks into elaborate scenarios, and he'd sit down to ask what story they were telling. He'd help Mara prepare meals while the twins watched from Lila's chair, and he'd end up teaching them about measurements and proportions without quite meaning to. He'd carry Lila outside in the evenings so she could watch the sunset, and he'd find himself telling her about the land, how to read weather in the clouds, what the different bird calls meant, where the deer came to drink at dawn. It felt natural in a way that surprised him, this gradual knitting together of separate lives into something shared. He'd thought family was supposed to be harder, more fraught with conflict and negotiation. Instead, it felt like water finding its level, settling into patterns that worked because they served everyone's needs. 3 weeks after the injury, Mara unwrapped Lila's ankle for the final time. The swelling was gone. The bruising faded to yellow-green shadows. She had Lila flex and rotate the joint, watching carefully for signs of pain or weakness. "Looks good," she said finally. "You can start putting weight on it again, but carefully. No running for another week at least." Lila stood slowly, testing the ankle with visible nervousness. When it held, when pain didn't shoot through the joint, her face broke into the first real smile Clay had seen from her. She took a tentative step, then another, then threw herself at Mara with the abandon of a child who'd been held still too long. "Thank you, thank you, thank you," she said into Mara's shoulder. Mara held her tight, and Clay saw the shine of tears in her eyes before she blinked them away. "You did the hard part, sweetheart. Staying still, doing your exercises, being patient. That took real strength." That evening, they celebrated Lila's recovery with a special supper, chicken Mara had been saving for an occasion worth marking, and biscuits made with butter instead of lard, and wild strawberries the twins had picked before the injury. The meal felt ceremonial somehow, marking not just Lila's healing, but something larger, some threshold crossed in their life together. After the twins were asleep, Clay sat on the porch while Mara finished cleaning up inside. The night was cool finally, the oppressive heat breaking as August edged toward September. Stars were coming out in the darkening sky, more stars than a person could count in a lifetime of trying. Mara emerged and sat beside him on the step, close enough that he could feel the warmth of her even through the cooling air. They sat in silence for a while, the comfortable kind that didn't need filling. "I've been thinking," Mara said eventually, "about winter." "What about it?" "The cabin's going to feel small when we're all trapped inside for months. 3 people who aren't used to each other yet, confined to 3 rooms with nowhere to go when we need space." Clay had thought about this too, lying in the loft while wind howled and imagining long, dark months with no escape from proximity. "I could expand the loft, make it more finished, give the twins their own room up there. That would help, but I was thinking more about us, about how we're going to manage being married without actually being married." She paused, choosing words carefully. "How long were you planning to wait before that changed?" The question sat between them, blunt and unavoidable. Clay had been carefully not thinking about it, had told himself they had time, that there was no rush to figure out the physical aspects of a marriage that had started as pure practicality. "I wasn't planning anything specific," he said honestly. "Figured we'd know when it felt right, if it ever did. And if it doesn't, what then? Then we keep on like we are. Partners, friends, maybe. A family that works even if it doesn't look like what people expect." Mara was quiet for a long moment, her profile outlined against the last light in the western sky. When she spoke, her voice carried a vulnerability he rarely heard from her. I'm not afraid of it, you know. Being a wife in all the ways that means. I'm not some delicate thing who needs protecting from the physical realities of marriage. She turned to look at him directly. But I need to know it would be because we both wanted it, not because you felt obligated or because it's what married people are supposed to do. I've had enough of doing things because they're supposed to happen. I want to choose. I want us both to choose. Clay met her eyes, saw the honesty there, and the quiet strength that he'd come to recognize as fundamentally Mara. I want that too, the choosing part. And I'll tell you true, I do want you. Have since about the second week you were here, when I came in from checking fence and found you'd organized the tack room, and suddenly I could find things that had been lost for months. Sounds stupid when I say it out loud, but it wasn't about the tack room. It was about you caring enough to make my life easier without being asked. That's not stupid. Mara's hand found his in the darkness between them. I started wanting you when you freed that fox. When you could have killed it easy and nobody would have questioned it, but you chose the harder thing because it seemed right. That told me who you were under all the rough edges. Their fingers laced together, callus against callus. Two work-worn hands that understood effort and endurance. Clay felt the moment shift, felt possibility opening between them like a door he hadn't known was there. So what do we do? He asked. We take our time. We keep choosing each other, day by day, until one day it doesn't feel like a choice anymore. It just feels like truth. Clay nodded, understanding in a way that went deeper than words. They sat there on the porch step as full dark came on, hands linked, not kissing or rushing toward anything but letting the knowledge of mutual wanting exist between them like a promise made without urgency. When they finally went inside, Mara paused at the bedroom door and looked back at him with an expression that held both question and answer. Good night, Clay. Good night, Mara. She smiled then, small but real, and closed the door. Clay climbed to the loft feeling lighter than he had in weeks, carrying the warmth of her hand in his and the certainty that whatever they were building it together. The next morning brought trouble of a different kind. Clay was saddling his horse, preparing to ride the south range where he'd spotted cattle bunching up the day before, when he saw the rider coming fast from the direction of town. The horse was lathered, pushed hard, and the man in the saddle sat with the urgent posture of someone carrying bad news. It was Samuel Reeves' youngest boy, barely 18, his face flushed from the hard ride. Mr. Hartman, he called as he pulled his horse to a sliding stop. My pa sent me to warn folks. There's cattle down sick over at the Morrison place. Started 3 days ago with one cow. Now it's spread to half the herd. Clay felt ice form in his stomach. Cattle plague could wipe out a ranch faster than drought or wolves or any natural disaster. If it spread through the valley, every rancher would be ruined. What kind of sick? What are the symptoms? Fever, won't eat, stumbling around like they're drunk. Morrison shot 2 that went down and couldn't get up. The vet from Miles City came out yesterday, said it might be blackleg or might be something worse. Either way, he's recommending everyone keep their herds isolated until we know what we're dealing with. Morrison's place is 5 miles from here. If he's got sick cattle, could already be in your herd, yes sir. That's why Pa wanted folks warned quick. Check your stock, watch for symptoms, and keep them separated if you can. The boy rode off to spread the word to the next ranch, leaving Clay standing with his half-saddled horse and a sick feeling in his gut. If cattle plague hit his herd, everything he'd built would collapse. He couldn't afford to lose even a quarter of his stock, let alone half. And with winter coming, with a family depending on him now, the stakes were higher than they'd ever been. Mara appeared in the cabin doorway, alerted by the commotion. What's wrong? Clay told her, the words coming out clipped and tight. She listened without interrupting, her face growing serious. What do you need to do? Ride the whole range. Check every animal. Look for symptoms. If I find any, I'll have to shoot them before it spreads. If I don't find any, I'll need to separate the herd into smaller groups, keep them apart, so if one group gets sick, the others might stay healthy. That's at least 2 days of work. Maybe 3, depending on what I find. Mara nodded, already thinking. I'll pack you supplies, food, water, your rifle. You'll need to camp out there if you're covering that much ground. I I can't leave you and the twins alone that long. We'll be fine. I know how to shoot if something comes around that shouldn't, and frankly, you being here won't matter if we lose the cattle and can't make it through winter." Her voice was pragmatic, cutting through his protective instincts with simple logic. "Go. Do what needs doing. We'll manage." Clay wanted to argue, wanted to find some way to do the necessary work without abandoning them, but Mara was right. The cattle were their survival. Everything else was secondary. He saddled up quickly while Mara packed supplies in the worn saddlebags he used for overnight trips. The twins came out to watch, their faces showing worry they didn't quite understand. "I'll be back as soon as I can," Clay told them. "You mind your aunt, stay close to the cabin, and don't go wandering." "Will the cows be okay?" Luke asked. "I'm going to do everything I can to make sure they are." He rode out feeling the weight of responsibility like a physical thing pressing on his shoulders. The South Range was where he'd seen the bunching, and he headed there first, scanning the landscape for any sign of sick animals. The morning was already hot, the sun beating down merciless and bright. He found his cattle scattered across the grassland, grazing normally, showing no obvious signs of distress. Clay rode among them slowly, checking each animal for fever, for the stumbling gait the Reeves boy had described, for anything that looked wrong. It took hours to work through just the South Range, and he found nothing alarming, but the absence of symptoms didn't mean much when plague could incubate for days before showing. He moved to the North Range, then west, then east, covering ground he usually spread across a week in the space of a single day. His horse was tired, he was tired, but he kept going because stopping meant risking everything. By nightfall, he'd checked 2/3 of his herd and found them all healthy. He made camp in a ravine sheltered from the wind, built a small fire, and ate the food Mara had packed while stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns. He thought about the cabin, about Mara and the twins alone there. He thought about all the things that could go wrong, injury, predators, accidents he wouldn't be there to prevent. But he also thought about Mara's steady competence, the way she handled Lila's ankle, the quiet strength she brought to every challenge. She'd survived worse than 2 nights alone. They all had. The second day was harder. Clay's muscles ached from long hours in the saddle, and the relentless sun seemed determined to bake every drop of moisture from his body. He finished checking the last of his cattle by mid-afternoon and found them all healthy. No fever, no stumbling, no signs of the sickness that was devastating Morrison's herd. Relief washed through him, so intense it left him dizzy. His cattle were clean, his ranch was safe. For now. He started back toward the cabin, but he was still 5 miles out when his horse suddenly went lame. Clay dismounted and checked the hoof, found a stone wedged tight in the shoe. He worked it free with his knife, but the damage was done. The horse was favoring that leg badly, and pushing it harder would risk permanent injury. Clay considered his options. He could walk the horse slowly back, which would take hours and bring him home well after dark. Or he could leave the horse to rest and walk home himself, then come back with a fresh mount in the morning. He chose to walk home. The horse would be fine for 1 night, and he'd already been gone longer than he'd intended. He stripped the saddle and tack, cached them in a rocky outcrop where they'd be safe from weather, and set off on foot across country he knew well enough to navigate in the dark. The sun was setting when he topped the last ridge and saw the cabin below, lamplight glowing warm in the windows. Smoke rose from the chimney. Everything looked peaceful, untouched, exactly as he'd left it. Then he saw Mara on the porch, his rifle in her hands, standing watch like a sentry. She must have heard him coming because she turned toward the sound of his footsteps, her posture relaxing when she recognized him. He could see even from a distance the tension draining from her shoulders. "You're late," she called as he got closer. "I was starting to worry." "Horse went lame. Had to walk the last 5 miles. "The cattle?" "Clean. All of them. No sign of plague." Mara lowered the rifle, and he could see relief wash over her face in the lamplight spilling from the cabin. "Thank heaven. Come inside. There's stew still warm and coffee that's only been sitting an hour." Inside, the twins were already asleep despite the early hour, worn out from their own kind of worry. Clay washed up at the basin while Mara ladled stew into a bowl, her movements efficient and familiar in his kitchen. "Any trouble while I was gone?" he asked. "Nothing we couldn't handle. A coyote came sniffing around the chicken coop last night. I fired a warning shot and it took off running. Luke was convinced it was going to eat us all, but I explained that coyotes are mostly cowards when it comes to humans. Clay smiled despite his exhaustion. You did fine. We did fine. The twins were braver than I expected. When they heard that coyote, they didn't panic, just asked me what to do and then did it. She poured coffee and sat across from him while he ate. They trust us now, I think, really trust us. Enough to be afraid, but not enough to fall apart. That's good. That's what they need. It's what we all need. Trust enough to be honest about fear instead of pretending we're never afraid. Clay looked at her across the table, at this woman who'd stood watch for 2 nights with his rifle, who'd kept the children calm through uncertainty, who was talking about trust like it was something she'd consciously chosen to build instead of something that just happened. I'm glad I came home to you, he said. The words came out rougher than he meant, weighted with more feeling than he knew how to express properly. Mara met his eyes, and something passed between them that didn't need naming yet. I'm glad you came home too. They sat there in the lamplight while Clay finished his meal, not talking much but not needing to, the silence between them comfortable and full. When he finally stood to climb to the loft, Mara stood too. Clay? She stepped closer, close enough that he could smell the soap she'd used that morning and the faint scent of wood smoke that clung to everything in the cabin. I know we said we'd take our time, but I need you to know I'm not afraid. Of you, of this, of what it might mean. When you're ready, I'm ready, and I want you to be sure of that. Clay's hand came up almost of its own accord, cupping her face gently. She leaned into the touch, her eyes closing briefly. I'm sure, he said quietly, but not tonight. Not when I'm half dead from riding and you've been standing guard for 2 days. When it happens, I want us both to be fully present, to choose it clear-headed and certain. Mara's eyes opened and she smiled, a real smile, full and genuine. All right, but soon. Soon, he agreed. She rose on her toes and pressed a kiss to his cheek, brief and warm, then stepped back and disappeared into the bedroom. Clay stood in the empty kitchen with his hand touching the place where her lips had been, feeling something fundamental shift in the architecture of his heart. He'd built this ranch to prove he could survive alone, to create something that belonged to him and couldn't be taken. But standing there in the lamplight with the taste of possibility still hanging in the air, he understood that survival wasn't the same as living, and building something alone wasn't nearly as satisfying as building it with someone who chose to stay. September came to the Tongue River country with cold mornings and the first hard frost that turned the grass silver and killed everything in the garden that couldn't withstand the shift. Clay woke one morning to find ice crystals on the inside of the cabin windows, delicate patterns that caught the early light like frozen lace. Winter was announcing itself, giving fair warning that the easy season was ending. He descended from the loft to find Mara already stoking the fire, wrapped in a shawl that had seen better days but still held warmth. She looked up when his boots hit the floor, and something in her expression made him pause, a kind of quiet determination that he'd learned meant she'd made a decision about something. Coffee's ready, she said, and I need to talk to you about something before the children wake up. Clay poured himself a cup and sat at the table, watching her settle across from him with that careful posture she used when the conversation mattered. The pre-dawn light was gray and thin, making shadows of them both. The preserves are done, she began. 112 jars total. Mrs. Chen's taken half on consignment already, and she's agreed to buy the rest outright for winter stock. That's $56 coming in, minus what I owe for supplies. Clay nodded, impressed despite himself. $56 was good money, earned through work that had filled every spare hour Mara could find between other tasks. There's something else, she continued. Mrs. Chen mentioned that the seamstress who used to do mending and alterations for the store moved to Helena last month. She asked if I'd be interested in taking over the work. Simple repairs, hemming, that kind of thing. It wouldn't pay much, maybe $3 or $4 a month, but it would be steady income through winter when there's less other work to do. That's good, Clay said. You should take it. I wanted to make sure you were all right with it first, with me having my own income, my own work separate from the ranch. Clay studied her over the rim of his coffee cup, trying to understand what she was really asking. You think I'd object to you earning money? Some men would. Some men would see it as a reflection on them, like they couldn't provide adequately. Well, I'm not some men. Clay set down his cup. Mara, you've been working since you got here. Harder than I have most days and without complaint. If you can turn that work into cash we can use, why would I object? We're building something together. That means we both contribute however we can. Relief crossed her face, subtle but unmistakable. I just wanted us to be clear. I don't want to do anything that makes you feel less of a man, Clay finished for her. My worth isn't measured by whether my wife needs to work. It's measured by whether I'm building a life worth living. And I'd rather build it with a partner who has her own strength than someone who needs me to be everything. Mara's hand reached across the table, found his, squeezed once. Thank you for understanding that. Thank you for asking instead of assuming. They sat in the quiet kitchen while dawn strengthened outside, drinking coffee and making plans for the day ahead. It felt domestic and settled in a way that still surprised Clay sometimes. This ease they'd found with each other, this rhythm that had developed without conscious effort. 3 months ago, he'd been alone in this cabin, and now he couldn't imagine it without her presence filling the spaces he hadn't known were empty. Later that morning, Clay was reinforcing the barn door against winter winds when Luke appeared at his elbow, that carved horse clutched in one hand and an expression on his face that Clay had learned meant a serious question was coming. Can I ask you something? The boy said. Sure. Are you going to stay? Clay set down his hammer, giving the question the attention it deserved. What do you mean? With us? With Aunt Mara and me and Lila. Are you going to stay, or are you going to decide one day that we're too much trouble and send us away? The words hit Clay like a physical blow, not because they were unexpected, but because they revealed how fragile the boy's sense of security still was despite everything. Despite 3 months of steady presence, despite patience and small kindnesses, Luke still expected abandonment. Listen to me, Clay said, kneeling so they were eye to eye. I married your aunt. That makes us family. And family means I don't get to decide one day that it's too much trouble. Family means I'm here through the easy times and the hard times, through the days when everything works and the days when everything falls apart. I'm not going anywhere, Luke. Neither are you. But what if? No what ifs. I made promises, and I keep my promises. You're stuck with me now, whether you like it or not. Luke studied him with those 2 old eyes, searching for deception or doubt. Whatever he found must have satisfied him because he nodded slowly, some tension leaving his small shoulders. I like it, he said quietly. Being stuck with you. Good, because I like being stuck with you too. Clay stood, ruffling the boy's hair in a gesture that felt natural now, though it would have felt awkward months ago. Now, you want to help me with this door, or you got better things to do? Luke stayed, handing Clay tools and asking questions about why things were built certain ways, and Clay found himself explaining not just the mechanics of construction, but the reasoning behind it, why you reinforced weak points before they failed, why you planned for the worst weather instead of the average, why you built things to last instead of just to serve immediate needs. He was teaching the boy more than carpentry, he realized. He was teaching him how to think about the future, how to prepare, how to build something that could withstand pressure. The same lessons his own father had tried to teach him, though he'd been too young and too stubborn to appreciate them at the time. By midday, the temperature had climbed enough to make work pleasant, and Clay decided it was time to tackle a task he'd been putting off, moving his belongings fully out of the bedroom and into the loft. He'd been living in a kind of limbo, his clothes still in the trunk at the foot of the bed that Mara slept in, his personal items scattered between 2 spaces. It was time to commit to the arrangement they'd created, to make the separation of sleeping spaces official and intentional. Mara found him carrying his things up the ladder and paused at the bottom, watching. You don't have to do that, she said. I know, but it's past time. You and the children need that room without my things cluttering it up. Clay. She waited until he descended the ladder and stood facing her. I wasn't objecting. I was going to say, you don't have to do it alone. Let me help. Together, they moved his belongings to the loft, making multiple trips up and down the ladder. It didn't take long. Clay had never accumulated much in the way of possessions, but the act of doing it together felt significant somehow, like they were actively choosing the shape their life would take instead of just accepting what circumstance handed them. When the last item was in place, Clay stood in the loft looking at the space he'd made more permanent, his bedroll arranged on the boards, his spare clothes hung on pegs he'd driven into the wall, the small shelf he'd built for his few books, and the whetstone he used for his knives. It was spare and functional, but it was deliberately his now, claimed and organized. Below, he could hear Mara moving around the bedroom, rearranging things now that she had the space to herself. The sounds were domestic and comfortable, the audio landscape of a shared life. That evening, after supper was cleared and the twins were playing quietly near the fire, Clay found himself restless in a way he couldn't quite name. The cabin felt too small suddenly, the walls too close. He pulled on his coat and stepped outside into the September twilight. The air was cool and clean, carrying the scent of sage and the distant promise of snow. Clay walked toward the pasture, leaning on the fence rail and looking out at his cattle, dark shapes against the darkening grass. They'd survived the plague scare. They were healthy and fat on good summer grazing. Come spring, the cows would calve and he'd have new stock to sell, new income to build on. He'd done it. Built something sustainable, something that would last. The ranch was solid now in ways it hadn't been even a year ago. But standing there in the gathering dark, Clay realized the ranch wasn't what made him feel settled. It was the knowledge that when he turned around, there would be light in the cabin windows. There would be voices inside, and laughter if the twins were in good spirits, and Mara moving through the space they shared with the confidence of someone who belonged there. He heard the cabin door open behind him, heard footsteps crossing the yard. Mara appeared at his side, her shawl wrapped tight against the evening chill. "You all right?" she asked. "Yeah, just thinking." "About?" Clay considered how to put it into words, this feeling of rightness that had settled over him, this sense that all the hard years and lonely choices had been leading somewhere worth reaching. "About how this turned out different than I expected," he said finally. "Better than I expected." Mara was quiet for a moment, then, "Me too." They stood side by side in the cooling air, watching the last light fade from the western sky. Then Mara did something she'd never done before. She leaned against him, her shoulder finding his, her warmth a solid presence at his side. Clay's arm came around her automatically, pulling her closer. She fit against him like she'd been made to stand exactly there, and he wondered how he'd ever thought he could live the rest of his life alone. "I've been thinking too," Mara said softly, "about what I said before, about being ready." Clay's heart kicked hard against his ribs. And I meant it. I'm ready. When you are." He turned to face her, his hands finding her shoulders in the near dark. "Tonight? If you want." "I want?" The words came out rough with honesty. "But Mara, I need you to know, I'm not just looking to claim what's legally mine. I'm not just trying to make this marriage official in the eyes of anyone else. I want you because you're you, because you're strong and smart, and you didn't break when breaking would have been easier. Because when I come in from work, I find myself hurrying to get back to you." Mara's hands came up to cover his where they rested on her shoulders. "I know. That's why I'm ready. Because I know it's not about obligation or expectation, it's about choosing each other." Clay pulled her close and kissed her then, there in the September darkness, with his cattle settling for the night and stars beginning to show overhead. It was their first real kiss, and it tasted like coffee and possibility and the future they were building together. When they finally pulled apart, both of them were breathing hard, both of them smiling. "Come inside," Mara said. "It's getting cold." They walked back to the cabin hand in hand, and when they stepped through the door into lamplight and warmth, the twins looked up from their game and Lila smiled. "You look happy," she said simply. "We are," Mara told her. "We're all going to be very happy here." That night, after the twins were asleep and the cabin was quiet, Clay descended from the loft and went to the bedroom door. He knocked softly, heard Mara's voice bidding him enter. She was sitting on the bed in her nightdress, her hair loose around her shoulders for the first time since he'd known her. The lamplight caught in it, turning it copper and gold. "Are you sure?" he asked from the doorway. "I'm sure. Come here." He crossed the room and sat beside her on the bed that had been his and was now theirs. What happened next was gentle and careful and charged with the weight of promises they'd been making to each other since the day she'd stepped off that train. It wasn't perfect, first times rarely were, But it was honest and real, and it bound them together in ways that went deeper than legal documents or spoken vows. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the narrow bed, Mara's head on Clay's chest, his hand stroking her hair. "No regrets?" he asked quietly. "None. You?" "Not a single one." They fell asleep like that, wrapped around each other, and when Clay woke in the gray pre-dawn, he found he was reluctant to leave her warmth and return to the loft. Mara stirred when he tried to slip away. "Stay," she murmured. "Just a few more minutes." He stayed, and those few minutes stretched into half an hour before they finally had to rise and begin the day's work. But something had shifted in the night, some final barrier falling away, and when they moved through the morning routine, they moved as partners who'd claimed each other fully. The twins noticed but didn't comment, though Lila watched them with knowing eyes, and Luke seemed more settled, like some question he'd been carrying had been answered without words. 2 weeks later, Clay made another trip to Miles City, this time taking the whole family with him. They had business at the general store, Mara's preserves to deliver, fabric to purchase for the winter sewing work she'd taken on. But Clay had private business too. While Mara was occupied with Mrs. Chen, Clay took the twins to the blacksmith shop. Isaac Mueller was bent over his forge, working a piece of iron that glowed orange hot, but he looked up when Clay's shadow fell across the doorway. "Hartman," he said in his thick German accent, "what brings you to town? I need you to make me something. 2 somethings, actually." Clay described what he wanted, and Isaac listened with the focused attention of a craftsman who took pride in his work. When Clay finished, the blacksmith nodded slowly. "I can do this." "When do you need it?" "Soon as possible. I'll pay extra if you can have it ready before first snow." "Give me 2 weeks. Come back then." Clay paid a deposit and left the shop feeling lighter than he had in months. Outside, he found his twins waiting patiently, and he took them each by the hand as they walked back toward the general store. "What were you doing in there?" Luke asked. "Getting something made. A surprise." "For Aunt Mara?" "For all of us, in a way." True to his word, Isaac Mueller had the items ready when Clay returned 2 weeks later, alone this time. Clay examined the craftsmanship, simple but solid, exactly what he'd asked for, and paid the balance with money he could barely spare but didn't begrudge. He carried his purchases home wrapped in oilcloth, and that evening after supper he placed a small wooden box on the table in front of Mara. "What's this?" she asked. "Open it." She lifted the lid carefully, and her breath caught when she saw what lay inside. 2 rings, forged from iron and polished smooth, simple bands that would weather and last. "We got married without rings," Clay said. "I know it's not gold and I know it's late, but I wanted you to have something that showed, that proved that this is real," Mara finished softly, touching one of the rings with gentle fingers. "That we chose this." "Yeah." She lifted the larger ring from the box and reached for his hand. "May I?" Clay held out his left hand and Mara slid the iron band onto his 4th finger. It fit perfectly, the metal cool against his skin, a weight that felt right and permanent. Then he took the smaller ring and slid it onto her finger, watching it settle into place like it had always belonged there. "It's not fancy," he said, suddenly worried it wasn't enough, that she deserved something better than iron forged by a blacksmith instead of gold bought from a jeweler. "It's perfect," Mara said firmly. "It's honest and it's lasting and it came from you choosing me. That makes it worth more than all the gold in Montana territory." She kissed him then, and the twins cheered, and for a moment the cabin was full of noise and laughter and the kind of joy that Clay had stopped believing he'd ever find. October brought the first real snow, wet and heavy, covering everything in white that would melt by afternoon but promised more to come. Clay worked harder than ever, preparing for the long months ahead, stocking the woodpile high, making sure every building was tight and weatherproof, moving the cattle to winter pasture where they'd have some protection from the worst storms. Mara worked alongside him when she could, and when she couldn't, she was busy inside, sewing alterations that Mrs. Chen sent out from the store, teaching the twins their letters and numbers, planning meals that would stretch their supplies through the lean months. They were ready. Together, they were ready for whatever winter brought. On a cold November morning, Clay woke to find snow falling steady and thick outside the loft window, the kind of storm that would last for days. He descended to find Mara already up, the cabin warm and fragrant with baking bread. Big storm coming, he said, looking out at the white world beyond the windows. I know. We're ready for it. And they were. The pantry was full, the woodpile was high, the cattle were in shelter. They had everything they needed to wait out the weather in comfort and safety. Clay pulled Mara close, kissing the top of her head. Thank you. For what? For showing up that day. For being what I needed even though I didn't know I needed it. For choosing to stay when leaving would have been easier. Mara leaned back to look up at him, her eyes bright. Thank you for taking a chance on us, for seeing past the complications to what we could be together. The twins emerged from the bedroom, sleepy and warm, and Clay found himself surrounded by family, by noise and presence and the beautiful chaos of shared life. He thought about that June day when he'd stood on the Miles City platform, expecting one thing and getting something completely different. He thought about how close he'd come to sending them away, to missing all of this because it didn't match his narrow expectations. What are we doing today? Luke asked, climbing into a chair at the table. Well, Clay said, looking at the snow falling thick beyond the windows. I think today we're staying inside. Maybe we'll move the table and I'll teach you all how to dance properly, since your aunt mentioned wanting that. Maybe we'll play games. Maybe we'll just sit by the fire and tell stories. Maybe we'll do all of those things. Can we really? Lila asked, her eyes wide with the kind of hope that suggested fun wasn't something she'd experienced much of before. We really can, Mara assured her. This is what families do in winter. They make their own entertainment and they're together, and that's enough. So they did. Clay moved the table to create space in the middle of the room, and he taught Mara to waltz, though neither of them was particularly graceful, and there was no music except the rhythm they made with their feet on the floorboards. The twins watched and laughed, and then they joined in, and soon all four of them were moving around the cabin in a chaotic approximation of dancing that had nothing to do with proper form and everything to do with joy. When they were breathless and laughing, they collapsed near the fire, and Clay told stories about his journey west, and Mara told stories about growing up with her sister, and the twins contributed their own fragmentary memories of better times before loss had shaped their lives. They played simple games with stones and sticks, and they shared a lunch of bread and cheese and the last of the wild strawberry preserves. And the storm outside became something beautiful instead of threatening. Just weather, doing what weather did while they were safe and warm inside. That evening, as the twins were settling for sleep and Mara was tidying up the remains of their indoor adventure, Clay stood at the window watching snow continue to fall. He thought about the man he'd been in June, capable and competent, but fundamentally alone, building survival instead of life, enduring rather than thriving. That man was gone now, transformed by the simple act of accepting what he hadn't expected and learning to see it as exactly what he'd needed all along. Mara appeared at his side, her hand finding his, their iron rings clicking softly together. Happy? She asked. Clay pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder while they both looked out at the white world beyond the glass. Happier than I knew how to be, he said honestly. You? More than I thought possible, more than I had any right to hope for when I got on that train in Chicago. They stood there in the lamplight while snow fell and the fire crackled, and the twins' breathing settled into the soft rhythm of sleep. Outside, the Tongue River country was locked in winter's grip, harsh and unforgiving and beautiful in its starkness. Inside, a family that had formed from necessity and choice in equal measure had found something that transcended both. They'd found home. Not the place, though the cabin and the land were part of it. Not the legal arrangement, though the marriage license and iron rings confirmed it, but the intangible thing that came from choosing each other every day, from building something together that was stronger than the sum of its parts, from creating safety and warmth and belonging in a world that offered none of those things freely. Clay had ordered a quiet, practical bride, someone who would accept isolation without complaint. Instead, he'd gotten Mara, strong and stubborn and far more than practical, bringing complications he hadn't wanted and gifts he hadn't known how to ask for. He'd gotten Luke and Lila, two children who'd taught him that the hardest thing to build wasn't shelter or success, but trust. and that earning it was worth more than any accomplishment he could measure. He'd gotten a life that was messy and loud and full of needs he hadn't anticipated. He'd gotten exactly what he didn't order. And standing there with Mara in his arms, and his children, because they were his now, in every way that mattered, sleeping safe nearby, Clay understood that sometimes the best things in life were the ones that arrived unexpected and demanding and completely different from what you thought you wanted. Sometimes the best things were the ones you were brave enough to keep when every practical bone in your body said to send them away. The snow fell through the night and into the next day, blanketing the ranch in silence and white. When it finally stopped, 3 feet had accumulated, enough to make work difficult, enough to test the preparations they'd made. But Clay and Mara moved through it together, checking animals and hauling water and keeping the fire fed, their rhythm perfectly synchronized from months of practice. And when the work was done and they came inside to warmth and the children's welcome, Clay knew with absolute certainty that this specific life with these specific people in this specific place was exactly what he'd been building toward all along, even when he thought he was building something else entirely. He'd come to Montana Territory looking for land to claim and a future to carve from difficult country. He'd found both those things, but more than that, he'd found the thing that made land worth claiming and futures worth building. He'd found people to share it with, people who'd chosen him back, people who made the hard work meaningful and the isolation bearable and the long winters something to celebrate instead of just endure. That night, with the twins finally asleep after a day of helping dig paths through snow too deep for their small legs, Clay and Mara sat together by the fire, her head on his shoulder, his arm around her waist, both of them watching flames dance and feeling the deep contentment that came from being exactly where they belonged. "I love you," Mara said quietly. She'd never said it before, though they'd been living it for months. "I love you too," Clay answered, and the words felt natural as breathing, true as any fact he knew about the land or the seasons or the work that sustained them. Outside, the Montana winter pressed close and cold and unforgiving. Inside, a family born from unexpected circumstances and deliberate choices held each other close and faced the future together, knowing that whatever challenges came, they were strong enough to meet them. Not because they were perfect or because life had gotten easy, but because they'd learned the simple truth that some things built together were stronger than anything constructed alone. The bride he didn't order had become the wife he couldn't imagine living without. The children he hadn't prepared for had become the center around which his days revolved. The marriage that started as transaction had become the truest thing in his life. And as sleep finally claimed them both, still wrapped around each other in front of the dying fire, Clay's last thought was gratitude. For chances taken, for hearts that remained open even after being hurt, for the courage it took to build something new from unexpected materials, for the life he'd found when he stopped insisting it looked the way he'd planned, and started accepting what showed up instead.